Hi, everyone. Ooh, that was a long session now, but thanks for staying so long. I would like to start with a story. So just recently, I went to Prague to another PolkaDOT conference and want to exchange some currency. I want to exchange euros for Czech crowns. And whatever I tried, ATM or exchange office, I just got such a bad deal. And I guess you know this. You also had that experience. And then I wondered, why is it that in traditional finance, Forex or foreign exchange is still so expensive, the fees are so bad, why it's still so inefficient, and why it's still so intransparent? Like, you don't know why you pay those fees, who are the actors in the background that want to take their share. And I think everyone here agrees that the solution would be blockchain. Solution would be stablecoins, or solution would be Forex on blockchain. And that's what our project, Pendulum, is going to address. Hello, everyone. I'm Torsten. I'm the CTO of Pendulum. And I would like to start to give an overview of what our project is about. So Pendulum is a parachain project, which intends to be live on PolkaDOT later this year. We're not live yet, but we just recently secured a slot on Kusama. We're also not live yet on Kusama because we secured a slot in the current lease period, but we intend to launch in August. And our parachain on Kusama is called Amplitude. Our mission is to connect fiat networks to the DeFi ecosystem. What that means is that our goal is to become the central hub for fiat coins and stable tokens. But let me be more specific. Our blockchain is tailored for Forex. Or that means that we intend to create the ideal Forex ecosystem for dApp developers. Another aspect of Pendulum is also that we are tailored for business. So if you are a business with business needs, for example, compliance, and you want to build an application on blockchain, then you should build it on our blockchain. One example for a business need or a business application would be cross-border transfers from business to business, B2B. Another aspect of Pendulum that I want to point out is that we build local banking integrations for stablecoins. And what that looks like is what I show you on this slide here. This is an example of a cross-border payment, which starts in Europe and ends in Tanzania. So I want to transfer euros from Europe to a recipient in Tanzania, and of course I want to ensure that the recipient receives Tanzanian shilling. Now, Pendulum is in the middle of this transaction, and you see that Pendulum has local fintech or banking integrations in both regions. What that means is that there's a local bank that is able to tokenize euros, and there's a local bank or fintech in Tanzania that is able to de-tokenize Tanzanian shilling. And the missing component is happening then on Pendulum, where you still need to exchange these two tokens, euro tokens to Tanzanian shilling tokens. And that happens through the power of this Forex AMM, which is an automated market maker optimized for Forex. Optimized for Forex in this case means that, for example, you have single-sided liquidity pools, or you have price curves that are optimized for Forex, or, for example, you have a backstop pool based on AUSD from Akala. Now, it becomes clear that local banking integrations are important for us. But I said that Pendulum intends to be the central hub for stablecoins and fiat tokens. And for that reason, we also want to build bridges, and we already build bridges, to all blockchain ecosystems that have a great support of stablecoins. For example, Celo or Stellar, Solana. And by building all these bridges, we actually studied a lot of those technologies and possible bridges. That's what we did for many months. And it turned out that all those blockchains have different needs, they have different technologies, and for that reason, the bridges that you need to build to them work very differently. We abstracted from that and built Spacewalk, which is a unified concept for building bridges for stablecoins for PolkaDOT. And through Spacewalk, we bring in stablecoins from all these nice ecosystems into PolkaDOT, not just to Pendulum, but we make them available for all of PolkaDOT and to other parachain projects through the power of bridges inside PolkaDOT. Now, as a summary, what is important for Pendulum is that first we have local banking integrations, then we have our Spacewalk bridge, and we have Forex AMMs. I just focus on these topics here. Actually, Pendulum is about more topics, namely every TeFi application for stablecoins is a valid use case for Pendulum, but I want to focus in this presentation. And particularly, I want to focus on the Spacewalk Bridge and Forex AMMs. This is basically an agenda for this presentation. I will first talk about the Spacewalk Bridge, and then we'll go into more detail about Forex AMMs on Pendulum. Let me start with Spacewalk. I already said that Spacewalk is a unified bridge concept for .Sama. Or to put it more technical, it's a unified bridge concept for substrate chains. And it's not just a concept, but it's actually a concrete implementation. This is an implementation that has been granted with a Web3 grant, and although we are going to use it in Pendulum, it is totally independent of Pendulum. It is in its own repository, and everyone who builds a substrate chain or a parachain can just integrate Spacewalk in their own chain, and by that have the power of using those bridges to other networks. If you want to integrate Spacewalk in your chain, you just implement a pallet, and you also need to deploy some services that are required depending on what network you want to connect with. For example, you need to deploy Oracle services or custodian services. Now let me talk about the features of Spacewalk. What was really important for us is that we provide a totally decentralized concept. We studied a lot of bridges in the last couple of months or years, and it turns out that unfortunately a lot of bridges are totally centralized or claim to be decentralized, but they don't meet our standard for decentralization. And probably everyone observed that in this year alone, there were a lot of attacks on bridges. Just in March, there was an attack on a bridge where some single attacker was able to steal $600 million US. And that was just because the bridge was not really decentralized, although they gave the impression that they were. So decentralization matters. Additionally, Spacewalk is trust minimized. That means that if you have to interact with a human actor, the human actor is incentivized, economically incentivized, not to misbehave. And if they happen to misbehave, you're guaranteed to get your money back anyway. Thirdly, Spacewalk is censorship resistant. That means that if you have to interact with a human actor again, for example, a custodian, they would be able to deny service to you, but you can always go to another human actor in that decentralized network, or you can just deploy your own service, and by that, Spacewalk will always guarantee service to you. Now, I already said that Spacewalk is a unified concept. That means that it has a unified API if you plug it into your substrate chain independently of what bridge you actually use at the end. So we have different components that plug into the Spacewalk palette that provides that unified API, for example, for Stellar or Stellar. Now, I would like to actually, after this very general view, I would like to actually look at one example of Spacewalk, namely the Stellar implementation for Spacewalk. And the reason for that is that Stellar is particularly important for our use case. I already said that we have big interest in bringing in stablecoins. And Stellar managed to have a great support for fiat-backed stablecoins, 100% collateralized, compliant, and not that algorithmic stablecoin that made really bad news in the recent couple of weeks and months. So these are great stablecoins to have. And Stellar actually has more than 15 stablecoins that they arranged with local banking integration in many different countries. For example, Brazilian reais, Mexican pesos, Tanzanian shilling, Nigerian naira, and so on. So that's very important for us. I want to skip this slide because it's a little bit too technical and don't have enough time. So let me just quickly give you an overview about how Spacewalk for Stellar actually looks like. This is a little bit overwhelming, but bear with me. I go through it component by component. First, I want to point out that Spacewalk Stellar is based on InterBTC, and InterBTC is a bridge between Bitcoin and Polkadot, or to be more precise, to the Interlay parachain or Kintsugi parachain on Kusama. And the team between Interlay, they figured out how to build a bridge to a non-smart contract capable blockchain like Bitcoin in a totally decentralized manner and trust minimized manner. It's peer-reviewed and it's really great. And for that reason, we also use that concept because Stellar is also one of those blockchains that don't allow for smart contracts, which makes it just a little bit harder to build the bridge. But our Stellar blockchain, Spacewalk, is very different to Interlay in a very crucial point, namely that we have the Stellar Oracle as a central element. But let me first point out the other elements of the blockchain, of this bridge. So first we have two blockchains, which are the orange boxes. On the one hand side, we have Stellar. On the other side, we have the substrate chain. And now I want to bridge tokens from one account on Stellar to another account on substrate chain. This account is identified with this blue circle. And of course, token transfers with bridges are not actual transfers, but they're just simulated transfers, because you cannot really transfer a token from one chain to another one. And the simulation happens by first locking tokens in special accounts on the Stellar side. Those accounts are called vaults. There can be an unlimited number of those vaults. It's totally decentralized. And as long as those coins are locked in these vaults, they're rendered unusable in Stellar. And as long as they are locked, you can have a copy of this coin on substrate, a so-called wrapped token. Now, I already said that Stellar does not have smart contracts, and that means that these vaults cannot be controlled by smart contracts, which would be totally reliable, but they need to be controlled by human actors, who can be unreliable and can just run away with the money. For that reason, this concept uses collateralization. That means that the human actors need to first lock collateral on the substrate chain, and the Spacewalk smart contract or Spacewalk pallet is this contract there. So this manages actually this collateral. And it will also use an external price feed oracle, because the asset that you use in the collateral and the asset that you use in the vault is usually different, and the prices can differ, so that at one point in time it could happen that the collateral is not enough anymore to really cover the lock tokens, and then you need to actually liquidate the vault and give back the money to the user. That's why you need this external oracle for the price feed. Now we have another oracle, and this is the Stellar oracle, and that's the big component here. Namely, that's the main component that tells the Spacewalk pallet on the substrate chain what goes on in Stellar. And this is very important. Namely, whenever someone wants to send money from Stellar to the substrate chain and lock them in vaults, then the Spacewalk pallet needs to know about this. It needs to reliably know that someone locked tokens in the vault, and only then it will mint a copy, a wrapped copy of that token, and send it to the target account. And Stellar, the oracle usually sounds like something that's quite centralized and not 100% secure, but the Stellar oracle is provably secure, provably decentralized, and is at least as secure as the Stellar consensus protocol itself, because it very much uses the consensus algorithm of Stellar. It's very, very much tailored for that one. It's very special, very unique, and it takes features of that consensus protocol. Now, I don't want to go into any more details of this Spacewalk concept, because I also want to talk about the Forex AMMs. Maybe just as a conclusion, where we are in the development of this Spacewalk bridge, I already said that Spacewalk is supported by a Web3 grant, which consists of 3 milestones, and we're currently working on the 2nd and 3rd milestone. Now about the Forex AMMs. Before I talk about Forex AMMs, let's first look at a general blockchain like Ethereum, a general purpose blockchain. In a general purpose blockchain, we have 2 different main layers. First, we have the runtime layer, which expresses the general logic of the blockchain itself, which is hard-coded, which is hard to change, which usually stays the same. And then you have application developers who use smart contracts to develop their applications. Usually, automated market makers are developed as smart contracts on the application layer. Now, this is true in Ethereum, but Substrate and parachains on Polkadot actually use a different approach. Namely, they are special purpose parachains. So all those parachains have a special purpose, and what happens on a special purpose parachain is that you move this application layer down so that the application somehow lives inside the smart contracts and inside the runtime. And the component that you have in the runtime is called a pallet. It's hard-coded in the runtime, and what you do is that you try to identify common components of all your applications that reside in your smart contract, in your parachain, and you put them into the pallet. That's great because the pallet is much more efficient. It's 1,000 times more efficiently than a smart contract, and the power of Substrate is also that it's very easy to update those pallets. You can always have forkless updates. You can just add new features to pallets. It's by far not as restricted as the runtime on Ethereum, for example. Now the smart contract developers, the application developers, they would then build an application directly on top of that pallet using the API of the pallet and build the components that are common to their own that are specific to their own application. Now in our example, that will look like this. I already said that we will build, or we will incentivize a community to build a whole ecosystem of Forex AMMs or other AMMs. And those Forex AMMs would then be built as smart contracts, and you have a Pendulum-specific palette which integrates common components that all AMMs have in common. Now, in order to explain what AMMs have in common, I just want to give a very, very easy introduction to AMMs in case you're not familiar with them. So this is a very simple automated market maker, a so-called constant function market maker. And a constant function market maker, in this case, would be a market maker for exchanging US dollars to euro tokens. Such a market maker would always have two liquidity pools, which are expressed as these two jars now. These two liquidity pools, one for the one currency, the other one for the other currency, would hold some tokens. And since you only have two jars or two liquidity pools, then every state of this automated market maker can be represented as a dot in a two-dimensional matrix in this diagram that you see here, where the x-axis represents the amount of euro tokens in that moment, and the y-axis represents the amount of US dollar tokens in that moment. So if you have 3 euro tokens and 3 US dollar tokens, then this current state would be represented by this red dot that you see there. Something that's important for constant function market makers is that they would introduce a price curve. There's this blue curve that you see there. And the contract of the market maker is that whatever happens, however it interacts with the user, the automated market maker will always ensure that the current state, this red dot that you see, always stays on that blue line. Now, what does it mean? Let's say that someone wants to interact with the automated market maker and wants to give some US dollar tokens in return for some euro tokens from the automated market maker. Let's say I want to exchange and I want to receive 2 US dollar tokens, 2 euro tokens. I want to take 2 euro tokens out of that jar. Now the automated market maker can determine how much US dollar tokens I need to give to it, but just going to the left, 2 euro tokens, and then seeing how much it needs to go up to land again on that price curve. In this case, I need to give 3 US dollar tokens, a little more than the number of euro tokens. As you can see, it's a little bit steeper. Now, if you go back to the original state, I could also make the reverse transfer. I want to have some US dollar tokens in exchange for euro tokens, and you see that it works pretty much the same way. I just know that I go to the left and go down again, so that the concept that the market maker stays on the price curve. And in that state, for example, someone else comes and wants to make another transfer, another exchange, and wants to have even more US dollars. Now you see that because the curve gets flatter and flatter, that you need to give more and more euros tokens for the same amount of US dollar tokens. In this case, for example, you need to give another 2 euro tokens just for half a US dollar in return, because the curve is flatter. Yeah, so it's quite clear that way that the slope of the curve actually represents the current exchange rate. And those market makers are actually quite interesting, because arbitrageurs will always make sure that the dot will be pushed around to a point where the current slope of the current exchange rate represents the external actual exchange rate of this asset pair. And that's very nice, because for me as a user who wants to interact with this market maker, I will always find the actual exchange rate that I find on the real market, thanks to the arbitrageurs. It's nice for me, but not good for the liquidity providers, because the liquidity providers, they carry a high risk to these arbitrageurs. There's something like impermanent loss. Don't want to go into details, but at least there is a lot of risk for the people that provided the original liquidity whenever they want to get back their liquidity at one point. And for that reason, there are also other inventions. For example, these proactive market makers, they protect from arbitrageurs by taking external price feed oracle into account, and always make sure that always adapt the curve, that the curve is not constant, but it always changes, and the slope of the curve really reflects the external price of these asset pairs. So that at least solves the arbitrageur problem and makes it much better for the liquidity providers that they don't have that risk. So there are a lot of different approaches for market makers. There is a lot of research happening, and I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of ingenious new ideas happening in the future. And of course, we want that all those ideas are explored on Pendulum and that there is a rich ecosystem of those developers and those projects. Now, let's go back to the original view. And now with this knowledge, we can identify what typical components are that we need to implement as pellets and are implementing as pellets. For example, we might have a pellet directly for constant function market makers. We definitely have a pellet for oracles because price feed oracles would be important for a lot of projects. It might also make sense to identify the quality of a token and give this kind of API to Forex developers. And a pellet for proactive market makers is also important, as I just showed that proactive market makers are quite advanced and give a lot of nice benefits. If we now look on the side of the developers that provide the smart contracts and develop the Forex AMNs on top of that, given that we have those pellets, what do they actually do? How do they differ? Well, they need to implement the logic that's different between every market maker. For example, they can implement different price curves. They might also implement different liquidity pools. I just showed a market maker that has 2 liquidity pools, but there are market makers for a lot of liquidity pools. For example, you can have one market maker that would allow to exchange all kinds of fiat tokens. Let's say there are 50 different fiat asset pairs, and a single market maker would allow to exchange all of them against each other, so that you don't need to deploy a market maker per asset pair. Much more efficient. Price feed handling would be different. I already said that there are market makers that use price feeds and incorporate them into their own logic. Finally, you want to averse risk and have different economic models for that. For example, a backstop pool. It's very important for liquidity providers. And finally, you also want to give incentives to the liquidity providers. Liquidity providers, they carry a lot of risk. They need to lock tokens that they can't access. Of course, they need rewards. You want to reward them, you want to have incentives for them. Now, let me talk about the current situation. We initially start with 2 different AMMs. One is an experimental AMM, which is based on Uniswap v2. Not too special, already quite established as a really good market maker. But we have 2 different implementations, one as a smart contract in ink and one as a pellet. And that allows us to really explore the boundaries between what part of the logic should be inside a pellet, what part of the logic should be inside a smart contract. And that allows us to really explore what the ideal pellet for AMM providers would be, what kind of features you want to have in the pellet. On the other hand, we have a very advanced market maker, a next generation market maker, which is called Project Amber. It's the first community project on top of Pendulum. And as I said, it's very advanced. There is a new white paper that just got released. It's very interesting to read, has a very big set of very new ideas, and is very powerful. With that, I want to conclude my talk. Thanks a lot. I want to invite you to actually get involved in our project. Go to our link tree here, follow us on Twitter, or get involved in building either directly in our Spacewalk repository or on Pendulum, or consider to actually build a community project on top of Pendulum, for example, market makers or any other interesting applications for stablecoins. We are open for all ideas. Finally, if you want to connect to me, you see some links here. Thank you a lot. And if you have any questions, then please go ahead.